So the first thing I'd like to do is to introduce our panel. And so next to me I have Diana Gibson, who is Head of Communications, Engagement and Development at BirdLife Australia.
Marketing and fundraising.
I'm off to a good start. Okay. And then we have Wyan, who's the lead mentor at Salesforce Mentors. Got that one right?
Yep.
Excellent. I'm 50%. And then we have Alan White, who is from Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. And Alan, you are the Director of Fundraising, Marketing and Enterprise.
That's long.
Look at that. My averages have improved dramatically towards the end of that. So my name's Jason Hincks and I'm here from Salesforce. I am the Director of Non-Profit Industry Solutions. I should also disclose that I am in week 4 of said role. So I am high on energy and low on knowledge. So be very gentle with me. But the purpose of today really was to get an understanding of what the experience is like for organisations in the space. It's a really, it's an interesting time, it's fair to say. We've come off a period which is, I would say, unprecedented, and with all the unique challenges that have been involved in COVID and the other challenges that we've faced over the past couple of years. And so I thought the place that I might start as a conversation starter is, as many of you know, Salesforce released the NGO Trends report a couple of months back. I thought we'd just anchor in a couple of those observations, but use that as a conversation starter just to understand what your experience is, but also keep this quite conversational. And it doesn't have to be panel conversation then questions. If you've got something that you feel is interesting or a question you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and jump in. So I guess the place I'd like to start is that one of the not surprising but alarming figures in the report said that about 30% of mid and large size organisations said that keeping their non-profit or charity from permanently closing was a challenge. And so that's a comment just to sit with for a second, is that almost a third of organisations were worried that they were going to close permanently. And if we look at what that's driven in terms of activity and strategy within those organisations, there's a couple of primary levers that they've responded with, and the first one has been controlling expenses. So the first thing you do when you're in trouble is, how do we reduce our expenditure? But what I found really interesting in that was that a majority of charities, in fact 58% of organisations in the Connecting Up research, said that they couldn't clearly understand or couldn't clearly define what the impact of their programs are. So the question that I have for you is, how do you, from a rationalisation and cost-saving perspective, how do you bridge that gap between needing to focus on those programs that are high order, high value, most effective, but there's certainly still a knowledge gap around being able to define in a meaningful way what the impact that you're having in those programs are. So I thought I'd start with a nice easy question for the panel. But can you talk to your experience in that space? Like, what are you seeing in your organisation? Why, and what are you seeing in the conversations you're having with others about finding a solution to that? We need to understand what impact is, but there's a significant data gap at the moment.
I think part of the interesting conversation about impact measurement is it's not purely objective, and it's not it's not unpolitical, right? So who's your audience for your impact measurement? Is this a way that you're trying to increase your institutional donors? Is this a way that you can say to a small donor, this is like evolving from a classic dollar handle model of $50 will buy a well, and what did you actually do with that money? What did we do with that money, right? So it is definitely what's the strategy behind that impact measurement. But I think, touching on your point a bit more deeply, are we effective as an organisation? I think that's a really critical conversation, and I think a lot of that is about being data literate, and I don't think non-profits are often very good at being data literate. There is a little bit of, well, we're acting our values, so therefore we're doing good, but skipping those middle steps about, are we doing enough good? Could we be doing more good?
Yeah.
I'd probably add to that by also separating out what impact actually looks like. So for small organisations that have low-level literacy around data, analysis and data collection, or even they don't have the systems to collect the data, often it's at an output level, and that's actually okay. I think we sometimes put too much pressure on organisations and within the sector to have M&E frameworks, to have outcome measurement frameworks, to connect that to their theory of change. And so people should be encouraged to start somewhere, and so output is actually a great place to start. And then you follow that by looking at outcomes. So what are the outcomes of the output, and how do you communicate those outcomes and educate your audience on the outcomes? Because ultimately, from a fundraising or public engagement perspective, many of your general population won't see the difference between the output and the outcome. They'll go, fantastic, you gave food to X number of people, but they won't qualify that by what's the outcome of doing so. Was there higher levels of nutritional value? Could people attend work? Could they attend school? So balancing the difference between those two, but accepting that they're different and that people will have different levels of capacity to engage with that is really important. And then the third part would be, well, what's impact? Because impact is obviously a long-term measure. And I think that's where people can sometimes get a little bit confused between the three. So you're right about that data piece and about people's level of literacy, but it's about starting somewhere and then looking to have a long-term view about how you use the right systems and technology to actually capture the data for the long term, so that you can eventually get to an impact measurement scale. And then obviously from a public engagement or a fundraising or brand perspective, you can take that information in snippets and use it for the right audience. And I would say that's probably a big piece of the puzzle coming out of COVID. A lot of people focused on output because they could, but now there's a demand from institutional funders and donors to go, well, actually, what's your program logic? What's behind the output?
It's a really interesting point, this idea of, for a lot of organisations, they are faced with a conversation with a corporate donor or a foundation that says, oh, we want you to now plug directly into our ESG framework or whatever their chosen measurement is. And that can be pretty daunting, right, if you're at the early stage of that process. So I really like that idea of going, before you worry about that as a crisis, think about where we are in that stage. And so if you're at activity, that's great. So you're either at anecdote, your activity, and then eventually you want to get to impact. But making sure you have a good foundation and understanding of what those measurements are in current state, I think is really important.
And one of the quickest and easiest ways to do it, building on both Wyan and Alan, is look, you just need a piece of paper with 4 columns in it. So this isn't complex. You can make, the more mature you become as an organisation, it is likely you will want to move on, and you will start wondering what a thing called a theory of change is, and you will wonder how are we going to measure impact as opposed to activity or output. But all you have to do is start with a piece of paper with 4 columns. You know what you're trying to achieve. It's as simple as what activities are we doing, what sort of outputs do they create, what's the outcome we want from that, and what is our aspiration in terms of outcome. It's as simple as that when you're small.
And then I just to add briefly to that, it's then about building the culture of it internally.
Correct.
Like I'm sure we've all been in organisations where we've tapped someone on the shoulder to ask for data and they say, oh, that's not my job, or I don't know where to put it, or I don't know what to do with the piece of paper. And so it's about building the right culture internally. So for example, within position descriptions, making sure that people have the role of data collection or data management or data reporting or grant funding reporting and acquittals, like making sure people know that it's an organisational responsibility builds a stronger culture of, making sure everyone's accountable for the end goal. So that everyone has a role in the data piece.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight. Let's now pivot a moment to the other main lever that you pull when you're concerned about the future of your organisation. That is, how do we get more revenue into the organisation? So I don't want to oversimplify the process here, but reducing the amount you spend and getting more money seem to be kind of pretty popular approaches to solving this problem. And so. One of the things that we've seen, and I've certainly experienced in the organisations that I sit on the board for, or that I have conversations with, is that challenge around filling the top of the fundraising funnel. The decline of tactics like things like change.org, which used to be this nice steady stream of contacts into the top of your funnel is starting to dry up. Organisations are scrambling to understand, what the next tactic is that's going to continue to fulfil those expectations that a tactic like that has created. Talk to me a little bit about what advice you would have for organisations that have that challenge. That are worrying about, hey, we've set these fundraising targets, and we're not quite sure where we're going to get these leads from.
Well, I guess one of the first things we all know is that a warm lead is better than a cold lead. It's much more cost effective to work with a warm lead. So at a really, really simple level, any contact you have may potentially be a donor. And it's thinking about how do you ensure that you're capturing the details with all the right privacy and with all the right permissions around it, but make sure you do that, because that is you creating your own funnel for a start. And it is best for you if you can pull people towards you through that funnel yourself. It means you have warm contacts. We know there are all sorts of other ways that you can go, and you can be buying lists and whatever else, cooperative lists, but get your own house in order and make sure you're really getting those contacts on board first.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because what I see a lot of at different organisations is that kind of classic protectiveness of a cohort. So don't send my volunteers a fundraising ask.
We've been there.
Yeah.
And we did, and it worked.
Yeah, and the best example of this that I saw, I worked at an organisation that did bereavement support for families, and the nurses said, do not send our bereaved families fundraising asks. That's completely inappropriate. We're going to protect them. We're going to save them from our predatory fundraising team. And actually, when they dug into that, they realised that community fundraising by a bereaved family was a critical part of the grieving process, and it helped them to give back to the organisation and had done a lot for them. So this kind of paternalistic approach, with all the best intentions by the nurses, was poorer outcomes for their clients and poorer outcomes for the organisation.
And look, I think everything that's been said is great. The only thing I'll add is let's perhaps stop seeing fundraising expenditure as an expense, and let's actually educate our boards and our committees and those in positions of power to stop seeing it as an expenditure that should be hidden away in an annual report, and actually celebrate it as a really good level of investment. Let's all just remember that if any corporate organisation spent the money that we do within our organisations for the return we get, we'd be rewarded with the biggest bonuses known to man. So it's really important to remember that actually what we do with the money we have is quite impressive. So let's see it as a really great educated investment that we celebrate, and of course celebrate sustainability. So celebrate sustainable investment. One of the biggest pieces out of COVID was that many boards and many organisations, and I was working on a number of these type of panels and working with charities, they weren't educated about the literacy of sustainable investment. And that meant that was the first thing to go during COVID, which meant that organisation lost its marketing budget, lost its acquisition budget, it lost its relevance in the COVID environment when people were actually, the range of unsolicited giving was at its highest over the last 2 years in, I think, nearly all of Australia's giving trends that have ever existed, unsolicited giving. But if you don't have a place in market, if your brand isn't strong, if you're not investing to make sure that people know that you're there, then you don't get the unsolicited giving, you don't get the sustainable revenue, you don't get those really warm leads. The best type of lead is someone who goes, oh, I'm sort of interested in you, I'm going to give you $15 and wave a white flag and say, now engage with me more. That's the best type of warm lead. But then many donors out of COVID act like emergency appeal donors. They tend not to give again. So it's our role to invest in what that future looks like for them in our organisation.
And so, what's your instinct around where you think that trend is going? You hear a lot in conversations around that there's a lot of fatigue in the marketplace. That we have, we've gone from crisis to crisis. We've gone from bushfire to COVID to floods. There's, it has been certainly an environment where there's a lot of discrete asks that are happening, but we've also seen, for the most part, regular giving and those more longer-term contributions to organisations outperform their budgets for the most part. Right? What would you be, encouraging organisations to be doing and to create better analysis and better forecasting around their fundraising? One of the, for a bit of context, that one of the stats that came out of the NGO report was the fact that only 31% of organisations were able to accurately forecast their fundraising revenue. And that ranged from 0% in low maturity organisations to 64% in high digital maturity organisations. So let's start with the first group. Where should they start? What's the first thing that you would encourage organisations to be doing to have a better handle on forecasting? To have more confidence in the numbers that they're putting in their budget and putting before their CEOs of their boards.
Can I jump in, because I really want to address something in this one, and it's the idea, and it's probably a bit arrogant for me to say, I'm not an expert, but donor fatigue in that term is absolutely ridiculous, and it's actually wrong. It is completely wrong. It does not exist. And it's really, really important that we remove that vernacular from our organisations. The reason being is people are adults. Behavioural science says that people can make active decisions, emotional decisions, and in fact it's supported by the evidence out of the 2020 bushfire report in Royal Commission and the work by the More Strategic and FIA, that actually people gave extra donations to the bushfire appeal. They didn't re-delegate their donations. People are adults, they can make active decisions and emotionally intelligent decisions about where they give. Donor fatigue is not a concept. What instead people use donor fatigue, what they really mean is poor management of donor relationships, lack of supporter centricity, and therefore we send people too many emails or we send them the wrong things. They get tired of hearing from us because we're not telling them the things that they want to hear or engage with, and therefore they unsubscribe. That's not donor fatigue.
So let me reframe the question, because I think that's a really good response, and I absolutely agree with that response. And in some ways that's the provocation, right? So it's in every conversation that you have, but the data doesn't support that position. So let me reframe the question in probably a little bit more of a controversial way. How do you stop fundraisers using that as an excuse not to have a braver approach to raising funds in their organisation?
Would you guys, I don't want to take the floor, so...
I was just going to ask, is it always the fundraiser though?
Well, I mean...
That's the first question. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
I mean,
so it is about education.
Yeah.
There's a lot of education to be done, and that is part of all of our roles as fundraisers, is that education all the way through from our staff and our peers and our execs and our boards, is to really have them see the benefit. And this comes back to, impact. It comes back to understanding that it's an investment, not an expense. To understanding that there is not a thing called donor fatigue, that in fact it is about how you steward and how you manage and how you activate and how you capture your donors. So it really is about having them or getting them educated around you so that you can actually continue to do what you need to do.
And just a quick question for the group. Can you chuck your hand up? Who participates in sector benchmarking?
Not yet.
Get onto sector benchmarking. It is your number one tool of evidence and, I dare say, weapon to support your argument around forecasting. So not everyone will have the tools and perhaps the right systems to forecast really well. So you only have certain pieces of data or information, and you want to get there eventually. But benchmarking is a wonderful tool to talk about investment strategies, to talk about where your forecasting lies and where your trends lie against the sector. So I would absolutely encourage people to do benchmarking if they don't yet have the right systems to help with their forecasting.
I'd also suggest make sure that you have access to the income reports for your organisation. Make sure that you know what is coming in through each of your appeals, but you know within the context of the organisation, because you need that data as a fundraiser. If you don't have that data across the whole of the organisation, you're sitting in a little silo, and it's very difficult then to be able to forecast, to be able to see what you can actually do. And that's, you need your historical data and your current data, but to be able to understand that across the organisation.
And I think there needs to be a real, again, the data literacy aspect of it and having a culture of it, because this is not just a management conversation. This is how is our data entry staff coding donations. So many organisations don't properly record the difference between a hard credit and a soft credit. And how can you run a major donor program if you're contacting someone saying you gave us 10,000 and they said, I don't have any money, I'm a single mum, I'd raise $10,000 for you, I mean, that's going to put off a donor. Yeah, and they're not even a donor, they're a community fundraiser, right?
Yeah, totally.
So how do you have that data literacy embedded at every level of your organisation, so that when you look at that top level, when you're doing your segment comparison, your year on year, you can trust those figures, they're actually useful.
When I started at ASRC in 2017, everyone was just grouped together. And so we couldn't work out why the direct mail responses were just so poor. They were so low. And I thought, this is really strange for an organisation that's doing quite well with its fundraising. And we looked into it, and we were coding everyone the same, which meant everyone was getting this direct mail pack. And it was such a waste of money, and it was such a waste of time, because there was thousands and thousands of donors that were actually disconnected from the organisation. They were third-party donors, or they'd given an in memoriam gift. So they're very unlikely to give again. And it doesn't mean that you don't want to try and solicit them at points in time, but you want to be strategic about when you do it. We dropped our costs probably in our mailing packs by about $5,000 to $8,000 for each appeal, simply by recoding people and calibrating them. And then at the same time, we raised income because we were focusing on investing in the people that actually were more likely to give. So that's where that data piece, and when that data comes in, what you do with it and how you code it is so important. And then of course our response rates went up as well.
And it's got to be continuous improvement too, because if you say these are our major donors and these are our high value donors, that's defined differently at every organisation. Are you checking that? Do you have those bands correct, or do you need to change the way you define those to get better outcomes?
Can I ask a question? Just how many different kind of codes do you have?
Oh gosh.
And is it based on amount of donation or lots of different things?
Lots of different things in terms of like recency, frequency, propensity scoring as well, and engagement scores, but all not done as well as it could be, I'd say. But then I'd say we have about, between tags and codes, probably about 20 or so. But then when you rip the data out for, say, an individual giving appeal or a mass activity, you've probably got about 60 to 80 different segments.
So just before we open up to some more questions, there was another, I just want to focus on an element of the report which I found, and I think, Dana, we had a conversation last week on a call about it as well, but there was a stat that came out of the report which was pretty alarming, I thought, and that is that Australia was amongst a small number of organisations that rated ensuring that employee mental health and well-being was maintained as a key issue, and I think it's certainly an issue that we've all faced, coming through the challenges that we've had over the past couple of years. But what was really interesting is when you look at that data and then you look at the provision of and access to services, Australia rated last in every category. And there's some of those categories that there's a reason for. We talked about the idea of, there's less smoking cessation programs in Australia because, there's not as many people that smoke, right? That's a problem that's largely solved. But taking a couple of those outliers out, we really seem to underperform in terms of the provision of and access to services for people around their mental health and well-being, which I found personally, really interesting and really challenging, because you mirror that with the fact that we have some of the best, most contemporary and some of the most impactful mental health programs in the world, yet we don't seem to be turning them inward into our sector and helping those in the sector that are struggling. So I just wanted to open that up as a final question. What can we do as a sector and leaders in the sector to facilitate and create a greater connection between that need and the great services that exist in the market?
I think there needs to be a recognition of, and it's something we're talking about in my organisation at the moment, we do services, we do advocacy, but often it's the periphery staff, such as fundraising, such as marketing, such as ICT, for example, who often get left behind because they're not deemed to be programmatic. So yes, there's EAP and things like that, but there's no real access to debriefing or things that are really important to people's well-being in the workplace. And so what I would say is organisations, and we're going through the process at the moment, how do we see people holistically as one, but also as key individuals with differing needs? And how do we create a supportive workplace that takes into account, from say even a budgetary perspective, what is the need for people to have time away from the workplace? What is the need for people to have access to mental health support above and beyond EAP? And how do you facilitate that? Because one of the biggest things in the non-profit sector, and we're seeing it across the board in terms of that great, resignation, is there is that hidden burnout for people that may not be on the front line, but actually they're on the front line. I think fundraisers are the front line because they're that first defence to keep the doors open and the lights on. So how do we actually make sure that we don't negate their needs? In a way, I would say that's probably a really important piece, and there's probably not enough research that's been done to continue that conversation just yet.
And I would suggest that many fundraisers, or most fundraisers, are eternal optimists. So that can quite often mask what might be going on as well. And I think one of the other things is many of us will have in our own organisations, we'll have services that we're delivering externally. And actually the expertise in those services could really help to position health and wellbeing for all staff within the organisation. I mean, coming from an environment charity, you'd think, oh, nah, you haven't got any of that because you're not in health. But actually one of the important things that we want to always have happen is that our fundraisers, our receptionists, our finance people get out into the field with the programs. And that's because they're with the people that are creating the outcome, and it actually gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of that they're actually part of delivering that program. They're not sitting in the back room simply, chugging away trying to be the cash register. They're actually a part of the program, and it helps from both the programmatic side and from the fundraiser side to do that, because they actually become closer together, they work better together, and we see ourselves as one program. So there's two things there. If you have services that you would be delivering externally that have expertise, think about how you may be able to bring that into the organisation itself, because you have the experts there. And even if not, think about those who, as Alan has said, are on the front line but may not be considered front line always in an organisation, how they can connect to that programmatic work and absolutely feel that outcome that happens.
I also wonder if this is, assuming that this is a bit of a reticence on non-profits to spend in these areas, how much is this maybe a fallout from a toxic conversation around cost of fundraising ratio? Because, I remember I worked at the Queensland Greens for a while, tiny organisation, but one of their policies said we should abolish part-time work. No one should be casual or part-time. Everyone in the office was employed part-time. And they justified it by saying, well, we don't have much money. There's plenty of small business that don't have a lot of money, plenty of charities that don't have a lot of money. But if you're trying to make positive change in the world and you can't even model that yourselves, that's a problem.
And if I could just add to that, any time someone says to you, don't invest in your people, and they're going to, it's fine if they leave, if they don't like the workplace or something like that. What's really important is that you actually give them the figures and the numbers about what happens when a key member of your fundraising staff leaves the organisation, what happens when those donor relationships are disconnected, and also the cost of actually rehiring someone in a competitive marketplace. Those costs will far outweigh the need to invest in your people and their well-being to keep and retain them. And I think we're only starting to realise that in the non-profit sector.
Yeah, I think there's certainly parallels to, if we think about your first point and last point, right, is this idea of stop seeing things as cost and see them as investment. I think there's parallels between those two topics, and I think that's true. And I think that there's certainly a financial argument for investing in your people, but we should also be doing it even if the numbers don't stack up, right? I mean, I think that there's an element of that's a great argument. But if it doesn't, if the math doesn't work, it doesn't mean we don't do it. I think that we have a responsibility, to continue to foster environments where people feel supported and feel safe. Okay.
Can I change the language there though? But I think it's in spite of the figures proving that it still is important, because I don't think the figures will ever show that it isn't important.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think that so my point was that shouldn't be the defining factor.
No, it shouldn't be the defining factor.
But I tend to agree. I think that would be a rare occasion where that's not math that works. Okay, so do we have any questions? Anyone have any questions for the panel? Would like to dig into any of those other topics any further?
I've got like a million, but...
One at a time.
Success manager at Salesforce.org. So one of my questions is, we talk about sector benchmarking. One of the conversations I've been having about a few of our big fundraising customers, Greenpeace, Compassion, these sorts of people, is common data models and getting better at giving the right inputs to that benchmarking. So that's a whole conversation, but I do want to up-level it a little bit and talk about just sector collaboration. So that's where they're identifying a good opportunity. The question is, what are you doing with the sector collaboration at the moment, and what do you wish we were doing?
Well, look, I'm on the board of the Fundraising Institute, so I'm probably a little bit biased here. And what I mean by that is that we are investing in, and so I'm feeling like I'm speaking for FIA here, but I promise I'm not. We're actually really looking at what does the brains trust looks like? What does the organic engagement look like between organisations? It's not typically about sharing of data sometimes, but it's actually about sharing of knowledge to solve common problems. It's actually about collaboration and coming together, and like real collaboration. And there's been some really interesting things come out of that, again, not trying to sell FIA conference, but there's an amazing presentation there about the Emergency Appeal Project, which has meant that the 15 largest INGOs in Australia have come together to collaborate resources around international emergency appeals here in Australia. That's a really good example of brains trust coming together organically for the right reasons, for the ethical reasons, for the growth of the sector, as opposed to just like intrinsic, say, benchmarking. So I think that sort of stuff that FIA, I think, is leading the way, and Philanthropy Australia is doing some really good work in. They're really important to have a seat at the table, and I would encourage, I don't know a lot of the people here today, so I don't know what organisations you're from, but it doesn't matter how small or big or where you start or where you end, it doesn't matter your budget, make sure you've got a seat at that table because it's invaluable knowledge. And I would say that's people are wanting to share. I love the fundraising, the Facebook fundraising page, Australian Fundraisers Network. Sure, there's a lot of interesting things that go on there, but there's a lot of good value, golden stuff. And people put their hand up and go, hey, I need some help. Can someone help? And everyone jumps in and helps. And that's what I love about the sector. When you get rid of the formal benchmarking that costs money and things like that, which is important, but you go, what's the value of our sector coming together organically? So,
can I comment from the environment conservation sector? I don't know if anybody else here is in that sector, but it's a really interesting proposition. We looked to the INGOs with absolute envy with what they can do around an emergency appeal. The environment sector, or the conservation sector, makes up about 3% of the total income of fundraising in Australia. So it's small in comparison to the others. We all know each other. We work together. So on the front line, we're constantly in partnership because in order to develop or in order to deliver a landscape scale change, you can't do it alone. I mean, we know most charities can't do what they're doing alone, but in that area you can't, the level of expertise you need. And I love the challenge, I love that question, because the environment sector itself, I think we're probably all still sitting in our corners on the fundraising side, probably all sitting there going, how on earth do we come together? We're very good at granting to each other, but that's a different relationship. That's a transactional master-servant relationship. So to actually look at how we as a group can come together, because as many of you will be aware right now, we are in environmental emergency mode constantly in this country. And until we work out how to go into an emergency mode together and be able to work together from a fundraising point of view, from a positioning point of view, we do it beautifully programmatically, but in those other areas, then I reckon we might just crack it and get a solution in Australia. So that's my little aspirational talk.
Yeah.
And Mr. FIA board member.
Yeah, I'll put that one on the list.
Yeah.
So. And I think this is a little bit off topic, but I think partly what's interesting with what's happening from a technology perspective around fundraising and around Salesforce as well, there's products like Raisely, which are so much more accessible for any scale organisation. Oxfam just ran their entire Trail Walker on Raisely. That was partly through necessity, but the point is it was possible. And a teeny tiny one-person organisation can sign up for a Raisely account and suddenly be running community fundraising programs. That wasn't the case 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I worked at an organisation and we had to choose either custom build an entire community fundraising solution, which is heavily technical, web-facing, very hard to do, or we ended up trying to implement a solution from the States and ended up only being the only Australian customer. It didn't work. But now that's not the case. So some of this, like, how do we collaborate, how do we share, it's much easier if everyone's using the same tool.
Yeah.
I 100% agree with that, Wyan, and I love what you do in your job, and I do think that there is something about when I was in the sector I just wanted everyone to be on Salesforce. Sorry, but just so we could be like, as we have people moving around, having the same conversation, having the shared knowledge, and when you are talking about your technology and your processes, really you're talking about other things as well, but it does help to make things concrete, especially when you're mentoring up those little people, because you're mentoring the smaller organisations, you're mentoring them and you're talking to them about Salesforce, but really you're talking about best practice, but just in a very concrete way.
Yeah. And also just start. Like just start somewhere. Too many people go, oh, digital, and I think we were saying this when we were catching up, like digital, oh, it's too hard basket, I just won't start. Don't have a resource, I won't start. And start. I'm looking at Jessie, right, from, who used to be from St Kilda Mums, and you just started. And then you started building something amazing and enduring for your organisation. And I loved that. You just started and you figured it out. And you didn't always get it right. And then you'd learn and you make it better and you just keep going. Like learning and developing, testing and learning. That's what it's all about. It doesn't have to cost a minefield of money.
And can I just add there, I'm going to do a spruik for the FIA, right? Anyone who's in this room who's involved in an organisation that fundraises, every single member of the staff should have done the FIA code. It's only $50 if you're not a member, it's $25 if you're a member. You should all do it, because if you're responsible for the collection and the safety and the privacy of data, personal data, then you must do the code, you must understand it.
Nice.
And you should be members of the Fundraising Institute of Australia.
Oh my goodness. I'll give you your payment afterwards. So.
No payment required. Thank you. And you should go to their conference, because every time I do that fundraising, I go to their conference.
All right, I'm going to put a halt to this hijack. I think we're almost at time, but any other questions? Anything else that we want to take advantage of this great group of people before we finish up? All right. In the absence of that questions, I've got one. That is that I think we've talked a little bit about this idea that the barrier to entry has been lowered a long way with technology, right? I mean, I think about my time in November, and just you had to build it yourself, right? Didn't exist. If you wanted to fundraise, with any FT, you just had to build it yourself, right? Absolutely not the case now, and that's the best advice I've heard today: is just get in there and do it, and figure it out. But it seems that the barrier that exists now is more around skills and experience, right? So the technology is easy and cheap, but where people tend to have a barrier to scale is where do we get the experience? Where do we get the resources to help us scale in this environment? What insight can you provide to people that are perhaps sort of starting to hit that barrier? They're starting to scale. They need some expertise, and it's a very tight market at the moment.
Yeah, it was always a tight market, I think, with Salesforce skills, and COVID completely accelerated that. I know plenty of organisations who just find it impossible to hire a system administrator, and partly that's why I started my business, to try and upskill people. I'm an accidental admin. I came up through that pathway, so I'm a firm believer that someone with a functional background, someone who's done a bit of fundraising, used databases, been on an inbound calling team or something like that, has a slightly technical mindset, not a coder by any means, but can write an if statement in an Excel sheet. They are the perfect people to become a system admin. So if you have that person in your organisation, you don't need to hire a system admin, but you need to resource that person properly. And I mean, give them 2 days a week where they can do trailheads. If they're trying to squeeze learning in 20-minute blocks in between people saying, this page layout stuff, I don't know what to do, I've got a great new idea for a project, then they're just going to bump along at this low level ability to actually help at all. But Salesforce does an incredible job of making online learning possible. So it is tough. And I think organisations have to go through the 5 stages of grief to say, well, we can't hire someone, we can't afford a consultant to do every single thing we want to do.
Yeah.
Consultants always have their place, but you can't rely on them to make minor changes to page layouts. So what do you do instead? You work with what you've got. And non-profits, one of the great things about non-profits is everyone's there with a passion, everyone's overqualified, everyone's curious, everyone's eager. Give them a chance to find those people and give them a chance to learn.
I would add to that just on the consultant piece. Recognise not everyone has the budget, but about 5 years ago, I'm happy to share, we paid $5,000 for an SEO consultant, we paid $5,000 for a social media paid advertising consultant, and their aim was to provide us with analysis, cost benefit focus, and I guess a strategy for 12 months that we could implement internally. We didn't have the skill set, but what could we do internally over 12 months? We then got that commitment of money. Then we said to our CEO and our board, let us see what we can do based on the results of that analysis and that audit and the changes we make. And if we hit certain benchmarks, will you give us a resource? Will you give us some extra funding? That was 5 years ago. We now generate probably over $1 million via SEO each year, organic solicitation via SEO, and about $1.5 million on social media. Now, that's ASRC, and I'm not saying that's everyone. We're a pretty digital organisation. But we started somewhere by actually just getting the internal knowledge that we didn't have to build some capacity to have the conversation. The best $10,000 I think we've ever spent, because now we manage it internally, we have the business case to get the resource internally, and we've gone from strength to strength. So you've just got to try and find a way to start somewhere, and I think consultants are a great way to start. Doesn't mean you'll use them ongoingly, but wonderful knowledge experts when you don't have it internally.
And just as well, by the time you've got your Salesforce system in and you're feeling highly efficient, right, so that you actually have the space for your fundraisers, because quite often we know that particularly in smaller organisations, your fundraisers may also be your processors. They may be doing your supported care and your processing. Hopefully you're able to alleviate some of their space and time in that. Train them, send them off to the FIA conference, but send them off to training. Help people upskill themselves on the fundraising product side so that they understand how, for example, SEO will pull through and activate people for you.
Perfect. Fantastic.
So can I just add
yes.
to that conversation? I would also say focus on what you do well as an organisation, right? You're not techniques. I'm not a technical geek. I've been doing Salesforce since 2008. I don't have an IT background. I can play, right? Rely on people who do have a technical background to do the technical bit of the work. Do what you do best. You fundraise, you run organisations, you deliver services, you do the work. So rely on people who do the technical stuff to work with you to define what you need from a technical perspective, but then also deliver it. And that's not a sales pitch from Sales Fix, although we're here. Talk to Jess about some of her people and getting them onboarded. Talk to Wyan about getting his support. There are so many Salesforce people in the world that can help you. Reach out. And then if someone within your organisation, as I did in 2008 working for a not-for-profit in the UK, went, this is such a cool solution. Let them grow into it, right? Don't necessarily get wedded to this idea of you've got to have an admin. No, you have to have someone who owns your solution and a commitment from your board and your management to continually invest in the platform in whatever way that works.
And then the third one there is reach out to other fundraisers too. Tap people on the shoulder. Like, I'm happy for you to share my mobile phone number and my home address even after today, but anyone who wants to touch base. The best thing we can do for the sector is build collaboration and learnings and share what we do. Let's forget the competition piece because that's boring. Let's instead do something better.
You talked about the Facebook page of fundraising, which I didn't know about.
Yeah.
But maybe what we need is some kind of, doesn't have to be Facebook because they're evil, right? But maybe a Slack channel for fundraisers that use Salesforce.
Yeah.
And we could all get on it and we could all help each other.
That sounds amazing.
I'll set that up. We'll link to the Trailblazer community, which people should still use the ANZ or Untitled Trailblazer community. Please, the resources are there. But I have been thinking about, since we acquired Slack, how do we, so Jason will have a chat about how do we use Slack to have more community-based conversations. We could thread this whole thing.
On that conversation about technical skills, I think it's also really important not to not to leave yourself out of that, not to dumb yourself down. We live in technology. We're fish that swim in the ocean of technology. So if people say, I'm not technical, it's not true, we all are, but there's gradations, right? If you code, that is a high level technical skill. And you will pretty much always need partners to do that work for you, right? You'll need consultants to help you.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is that, like, you may not need a system admin, you may just need your fundraising team to be able to create a field when they need it, or add a new opportunity stage. And people shouldn't be scared of experimenting. Yes, you can make mistakes, and yes, those mistakes can have lasting impacts, but way less than you think, you know? And Jesse is such a great example of that. Don't be afraid to play and make mistakes, because there are also environments where you can play and make mistakes safely. There's trailhead playgrounds, there's sandboxes that you can set up. It's one of the first things I teach to organisations that I'm starting mentoring with, is how to create a sandbox. So you can install the MailChimp integration or install a free project management tool and see if it's going to work for your organisation before you put it into real life. So culturally, I would love to see non-profits be empowered around Salesforce, but technology more generally. Have a crack at things, be brave, try things out, and not just say, that's the IT team's role, it's got nothing to do with me. Salesforce is used by everyone, and it's really powerful when everyone says, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is my suggestion for an improvement, how can we put that in place?
Did you know that nearly a third of all Salesforce customers are not-for-profits globally? Isn't that amazing? 55,000
Wow.
plus
Look at the learning.
right? There are so many people that can tap into and ask for help. And we've all drunk the Kool-Aid.
So, what a fantastic theme to end on. We are at time, or a little bit over, but first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for their questions and engagement, and wanted everyone to join me in thanking our incredible panel today. Thank you so much.